The Battle of Ilipa was one of the Hannibalic War's decisive turning points. There, Africanus would annihilate the great Punic Spanish Empire, a possession that had been won by decades of brilliant generalship and diplomacy, turning the tide of the war irrevocably in Rome's favour. On the open field of Ilipa, Africanus would earn his place as one of history's greatest tacticians and a master of manoeuvre warfare. Indeed, he would become a Roman Hannibal and cement Rome's place as the Mediterranean superpower. But how did this happen? Why was Spain so important, and could one man really change the history of the Mediterranean world, and therefore our own? Let's take a deep look into these questions by placing the Battle of Ilipa and the Spanish campaign in its wider context, with the aim of determining what actually happened. Spain, a land of blood and silver. Pre-Roman Hispania was a cauldron of competing cultures, nations, and civilizations. The combination of the climate, terrain, mineral wealth, and wider geography made the Iberian Peninsula one of the most unstable regions of the ancient world. The Roman Republic would fight the longest continual conflict in its long history trying to pacify Spain, and so fearsome and formidable were her people that the final conquest of the peninsula would not be completed until the late reign of Augustus, some 200 years after the Hannibalic War. The great Mediterranean civilizations had been attracted to the peninsula as early as 1100 BCE. Spain was rich in mineral wealth, especially tin, which was a key ingredient in making bronze. Phoenician traders from the city of Tyre in modern Lebanon, the mother city of mighty Carthage, established the city of Cadiz in around 1000 BCE, specifically to facilitate the mineral trade with the rest of the Mediterranean. These Phoenician settlements were primarily concentrated in the southern and southeastern coastal areas. This same mineral wealth drew the Greeks some 500 years later. Colonists from the famous polis Corinth founded the large city of Massalia in southern Gaul during the late 7th century. Massalia, in turn, established the satellite city of Emporion, situated on the foothills of the Pyrenees. Emporion, as the name implies, thrived as a centre of regional trade. Finished goods such as Etruscan pottery, Italian wine and olive oil were imported from the central and eastern Mediterranean and exchanged with the inland tribes for raw materials. Silver, tin, iron, and gold flowed out of the port to fuel industry in Greece, Italy, and Africa. Until the late 3rd century, this connection to the wider Mediterranean world was only ever a thin crust, a smattering of walled port cities spread along the eastern coastline. Behind the Mediterranean coast lay the land of the Iberians, meeting river dwellers in Greek. The Iberians, defined by a common language and culture, were a non-Indo-European linguistic group and were probably a native people. By the 3rd century, Iberians possessed a well-developed civilization with a written alphabet derived from a combination of Greek and Phoenician letters. Their society was highly urbanized, with the oppida, or hill fort, acting as the center of economic and cultural life. Saguntum, a major city of the Edetani, possessed stone walls and a large marketplace, and rivaled the Greek colonies in size. Iberian culture dominated the eastern coastal river valleys, from the Pyrenees in the north to Gibraltar in the south, and included tribes such as the Bastitani, Ilergete, and Edetani. These Iberian tribes had well-developed links with the Phoenician, Carthaginian, and Greek colonies of the coast. The Iberians were a highly militaristic people, with intertribal warfare a common state of affairs. This was primarily low-intensity warfare, the raiding and counter-raiding of neighbouring tribes and cities. However, the Iberians were certainly capable of large-scale, set-piece battles, several of which were fought with Carthaginian armies in the 3rd century. Later writers, such as the Greek geographer Strabo, described their style of warfare as asymmetric. The infamous Spanish guerrilla, armed as light infantry, using hit-and-run tactics and ambushes. However, modern scholarship is largely rejecting this idea as anachronistic, a function of Rome's Spanish Wars in the mid-2nd century, where hit-and-run tactics were a common feature. A wider analysis of the literary and archaeological evidence reveals earlier Iberian armies as having very capable heavy infantry who fought in massed battle lines. The Iberian infantry are described by the Romans as scutati, or those with heavy shields, and caetrati, or light infantry. Scutati were very similarly equipped to Roman legionaries of the late 3rd century, with a large oval shield, short sword and javelins. The Spanish sword, which would become the standard Roman small arm for centuries, was a direct copy of an Iberian weapon. Much like the Roman legionaries they would face, the Iberians would discharge their javelins before advancing behind the scutum, or large oval shield. Other than raw materials, one of Iberia's great exports was her fighting men, who served as mercenaries across the western Mediterranean. Further up the river valleys of the east and south resided the fearsome Celtiberians. As the name suggests, these people were Celtic. During the late Bronze Age, most of Western Europe became a Celtic dominion, with great waves of migrations rolling out of Central Europe. These people spoke an Indo-European language and shared a common culture, religion, and wider civilization. By the 3rd century, marauding Celtic tribes had carved out new homelands in Gaul, Hispania, Britannia, and northern Italy. In 390, a Celtic army of the Senones, a people from Cisalpine Gaul, sacked the city of Rome after the disastrous Battle of the Allia. During the 5th or 4th century, a number of these marauding Celtic tribes crossed the Pyrenees and settled in the vast central highlands and northwestern corner of the Spanish peninsula, intermixing with the local population. These Celtiberians were less culturally developed than the Iberians of the lowlands, with much less art and no known alphabet. They also lived an urban life, with the oppida, or hill fort, acting as the centre of economic and political activity. These fortifications were often formidable, as the year-long Roman siege of Numantia can attest. The Celtiberians were also a highly militaristic people, with a well-developed warrior culture and social hierarchy that emphasized military ability. The aristocracy were a warrior elite, each able to lead their own local units and expected to fight in single combat if challenged to do so. Whole tribes could be roused to war by mere insult, the promise of money, or minor border incursions. Warrior priests invoked the gods in highly religious ritual practices linked to war, indicating that conflict was a sacred element of Celtiberian culture. However, these wars were usually not fought to the death, but once a battle had been fought, with honour and funds restored, the men returned to their homes. Celtic civilization in general was renowned for its advanced metallurgy, and Celtiberian arms and armour were of a very high quality. The typical Celtiberian heavy infantryman was equipped with an ornate bronze or iron helmet, a large round oval shield, and the falcata, a medium-sized sword which had a forward bend. The falcata, similar in design to the Greek kopis, was a devastating cutting weapon, which could cleave through practically any contemporary armour. More wealthy members of society were equipped with brass breastplates and ornate composite brass plate armour. Mail shirts, chainmail as it is widely known, may have been worn, although there is scant archaeological evidence for its widespread use. In the southwest corner of the peninsula, along the winding Tajo River valley, lay the Lusitanians. These people are considered pre- or proto-Celtic, and probably are the remnants of the native peoples the Celts displaced. The Lusitanians were a nomadic people, moving their large livestock herds from one pasture to another. They generally fought as caetrati, or light infantry, who were lightly armoured with a small breastplate, but carried the caetra, a medium round shield that was slung to the back. These men could maneuver rapidly and were able to fight well from horseback or on foot. Raiding and brigandry were endemic in Lusitania. The various tribal groups were only loosely affiliated, and their constant movement made the pillaging of the lowlands an easy way to make money. Without fixed townships or cities, reprisal was difficult, and their mobility made these efforts hard to counter. Their repeated border incursions were a persistent source of conflict and instability for the rest of the peninsula. It was over this troubled country, a land of mercenaries, bandits, blood and silver, that Rome and Carthage would fight to determine the future of the Western Mediterranean. The Punic Empire in Spain. At the conclusion of the grueling First Punic War, Carthage was spent. Like all naval conflicts, the war had been extremely expensive. Both sides had built and lost massive fleets consisting of hundreds of warships, each of which had to be replaced. But for Carthage, defeat imposed a far greater burden. As part of the Treaty of Lutatius, she was forced to pay heavy indemnities to Rome. Every year for 2 decades, the city had to find 110 talents of silver to cover these payments. For a nation like Carthage, whose power rested in her wealth as opposed to her manpower, this financial burden was disastrous. Much like Venice in the Renaissance, Carthage was a city of traders and merchants. Situated in the very centre of the Mediterranean, the great port welcomed trade ships from every corner of the known world, with finished goods moving west and raw materials moving east. In her agora, the finest goods from Greece, Etruria, Egypt, Persia, and Phoenicia adorned the stalls. Punic merchants could be found in every port city from Gades to Tyre. All of this trade brought fabulous wealth, which allowed the great city to be adorned with beautiful temples and the huge artificial harbour, the Kothon. As with other cities that owed their wealth to the sea, such as Athens, trade allowed for the development of a large and powerful fleet. Before the First Punic War, the Carthaginian Empire was primarily a maritime empire, and the major islands of the Western Mediterranean had been under their rule for centuries. Western Sicily, the Balearics, Corsica and Sardinia were all Punic possessions. The Numidian kingdoms along the African coast were generally friendly and often paid tribute, although these were not true subjects of Carthage. Again, like Athens at the height of her power, the number of Carthaginian citizens relative to the size of her empire was small. The First Punic War forced Carthage to fight a protracted land campaign in Sicily against a rival that specialized in land warfare. To fight the Romans, she needed not just a navy, but a large standing army. To achieve this without a large citizen body or numerous allies, she enlisted vast numbers of mercenaries from all over the Mediterranean, but particularly Iberians. These men were far from home and had been promised rich rewards for their service to Carthage. When the funds could not be found to pay them, thousands revolted. In a desperate conflict, called the Truceless War by Polybius, the Carthaginians fought for their very survival as mercenary armies burnt large tracts of Africa and threatened the city itself. In 239, the garrison of Sardinia revolted and joined the rebellion. When a force was dispatched from Carthage to recapture the islands, the rebels appealed to Rome for asylum. Rather than handing over the rebels to their treaty partners, the Senate accepted the mercenaries' request and annexed the islands, forming a new Roman province. When Punic ambassadors protested to the Senate, they were simply met with a fait accompli, stating that any military intervention by Carthage in the islands would be treated as an act of war. Polybius viewed this act by the Romans as indefensible. The Truceless War was a desperate situation for Carthage. With most of her own army now turned against her, no fleet, and a crippling lack of funds, the very survival of the city was in grave danger. It was only the inspired leadership of the Punic generals which saved the situation. Hamilcar Barca was the most capable Punic general during the last stages of the First Punic War, leading an inspired guerrilla campaign in the Sicilian hills that lasted until the peace negotiations. In an impressive display of diplomacy, operational manoeuvre, and grand tactics, Hamilcar lifted the siege of Carthage by raiding rebel supply lines, brought several rebel settlements back into alliance, and won a number of minor engagements. In 238, leading an army of 40,000, including every male Carthaginian citizen of military age, Hamilcar met the primary rebel army at the city of Leptis Parva. In a desperate and bloody battle outside the city, the rebel army was defeated and destroyed. The rebel prisoners were, to a man, crucified, with the exception of the rebel leader, Martho, who was dragged through the streets of Carthage to be torn to pieces by the populace. Carthage had survived, but her empire was in tatters. Rome would not honour its treaty commitments, and if the city was to survive another Roman war, it needed resources of manpower and silver. Both of these could be found in abundance in Spain, and in 237 Hamilcar marched for the Straits of Gibraltar at the head of an army. With the friendly Phoenician city of Gades as a base of operations, Hamilcar began an aggressive campaign against the Tartessians, an element of the Turdetani, defeating them in a pitched battle somewhere north of the city. With their leaders killed, Hamilcar took on 3,000 of the defeated Iberians, swelling his ranks. Critically, by defeating the Turdetani and bringing them under Punic control, he gained access to the rich silver mines in the area. So began the virtuous cycle of the Punic conquest of Iberia. As more and more land came under Punic domination, Hamilcar not only gained access to greater stocks of the fearsome Iberian infantry, but gained the funds to pay them. After 9 years of continuous campaigning, Hamilcar had carved out a Punic empire throughout the southeastern corner of the peninsula, subjugating most of the Turdetani and Bastetani. In 228, Hamilcar was killed during the siege of an unknown Iberian operator, potentially drowning during a desperate retreat. Hamilcar was one of Carthage's greatest sons. It would not be an exaggeration to claim that he had both saved the city and conquered an empire that would return her to a position of Mediterranean great power. Arguably, history has not given him the accolades that he surely deserves. In the wake of Hamilcar's death, the command of the Punic forces in Spain was left to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal. Hasdrubal was a capable general in his own right, and was a veteran of the war with the Numidians. After subduing the Orissi, Hasdrubal founded the city of Carthago Nova, or New Carthage, to serve as the capital of the new Punic Empire. Hasdrubal continued the virtuous cycle initiated by Hamilcar, both expanding the limits of Punic dominion and, in turn, increasing the scale of the forces he deployed. With an army of 60,000 he marched north, eventually bringing the Cotestani and Edetani under Punic control. When Hasdrubal took the hand of an Iberian princess as his wife, he had been crowned king of the de facto bastard Spanish kingdom, which now included practically all of the Iberian tribes of the coastal lowlands. This was a remarkable reversal of fortune. In just 20 years, largely thanks to Hamilcar Barca, Carthage's control had swung from, practically, the land within sight of her city walls to the head of an empire which easily rivaled the Roman-led Italian Confederacy. From their holdings in Iberia, the Carthaginians could now put hundreds of thousands of men into the field in numerous field armies. Distracted by a series of massive conflicts with the Celtic tribes of the Po Valley, the Romans were, finally, taking notice. In 226, a treaty was made with Hasdrubal himself. A Roman delegation agreed that the river Ebro in the northeast of the peninsula would determine their respective spheres of influence. In 221, after 6 years of successful leadership, Hasdrubal was murdered by a Celtic servant. The army elected the 26-year-old eldest son of Hamilcar, Hannibal, to become the commander-in-chief of the Punic forces in Spain, a decision which was ratified by the Carthaginian Senate. The young Hannibal resembled his father, and Livy writes that the old veterans thought that Hamilcar had been returned to them in his youth. Indeed, in Hannibal, Carthage had a star that would only outshine his father. Within a year, the young Carthaginian had put the formidable military machine developed by his father and brother-in-law to use. In 220, he defeated the Carpetani, a Celtiberian tribe of the Upper Tajo Valley, obviously in an operation designed to secure the frontiers of the Punic province. By 219, Hannibal had become involved in a dispute between the city of Saguntum and a neighbouring tribe which was a Carthaginian ally. Although far south of the Ebro and clearly within the Punic sphere of influence, in 226 the Romans had agreed a formal alliance with the Saguntines. After a grueling 8-month siege, the city fell to the exhausted Punic army. The Romans were furious. They sent a delegation to the Carthaginian Senate demanding Hannibal's surrender. When this was refused, the Romans declared war on Carthage, and so began the greatest conflict the Western Mediterranean had ever seen. Rome comes to Spain. In Rome, the Senate prepared for war. Given the actions of the Senate, including the seizure of Corsica and Sardinia, they must have been expecting another conflict with Carthage. Rome's treatment of its former enemies and allies was, in many ways, unique amongst the great Hellenistic powers. Many of Rome's Italian allies were people she had defeated in battle. Unlike the Carthaginians, the successor kingdoms, or the Persian Empire they replaced, Rome did not usually require the payment of tribute by her allies. A defeated enemy of Rome could expect to be brought into alliance with her erstwhile adversary. The terms of that alliance were different in every case, but typically, no annual payment was required, and the city or tribe was left to run their own internal affairs as they saw fit, including the appointment of their own magistrates. Over time, the city may receive certain rights from the Romans, such as commercium and connubium, or the rights of trade and intermarriage with Roman citizens. The two parties entered into a mutual defence treaty, committing the Romans to come to the defence of her ally in all circumstances. In exchange for these benefits and lenient treatment, all the ally had to surrender was an independent foreign policy and provide a certain number of fighting men or ships when called upon by the consuls. Compared to the onerous tribute payments that many of the other imperial powers extracted, these terms were light. In times of peace, Roman allies could simply go about their daily lives, confident of the protection offered to them by the mighty Roman army. However, these powers were junior partners. There could be no mistake. Rome was the master, Italy was her mistress. Even for formidable enemies which fought Rome on even terms for decades, such as the Samnites, peace with Rome meant subservience to her. In the 17 decades since the Battle of the Allia, Roman history had been a story of victory over one foe after another, each to be brought under Roman leadership and integrated into a wider cultural, political, and economic system in which they had a direct stake. It was this generation of a common geopolitical entity, for which the Allied armies fought and died to protect, that was the foundation of the Italian Confederacy. This view of warfare was, however, not typical. If, for example, the Seleucid or Ptolemaic kingdoms were to fight a war over, say, Judea, when the two powers came to terms, some money and land would be exchanged, but neither would view the other as a subsidiary power. It is this difference in the way the Romans viewed warfare which may explain their treatment of the Carthaginians during the interbellum. For Carthage, the first war had been fought over control of Sicily. It had been lost, and Sicily, along with some indemnity payments, had gone to the victor. That should have been the end of the story, with Carthage free to pursue her interests in Africa, Spain, and anywhere else she saw fit. To the Roman Senate, Carthage was now an inferior power. She was not a Roman ally, but just like all the others, she had been defeated, and now the Romans had a right to guide her future. The emergence of the massive and wealthy Punic Empire in Spain was shattering to these illusions, as the lesser power now rivaled Rome again in wealth and military potential. This state of affairs was not one the Romans could easily accept, which probably explains much of their actions prior to the war. In 218, Publius Cornelius Scipio and Tiberius Sempronius Longus were elected consuls. Rome was a power that was especially well suited to fighting large-scale wars in multiple theatres. With two consuls, each embodied with supreme military authority, the Roman military was capable of simultaneously fighting 2 campaigns, even 2 wars, in vastly different areas. The Senate intended to utilize this feature to its full extent in the war with Carthage. The enemy had 2 main centers of power, Spain and Africa. The Romans intended to attack the Carthaginians in both places. Scipio would use the Roman navy to advance to northern Iberia, utilizing the friendly Greek city of Emporion as a base to begin a campaign against Hannibal. Longus, conversely, would deploy to Sicily and begin to make preparations for an invasion of Africa. Each of the 2 consuls were given a consular army to command, the Romans' typical field army in this period. The consular army was comprised of 2 legions of Roman citizens and 2 legion equivalents of Italian allies, called alae or wings. This formation was a balanced force, equipped with a mix of light infantry, legionary heavy infantry and cavalry. Its strength was around 20,000 foot and 2,000 horse. This size was large enough to handle most challenges, but also small enough to be sustainable from a logistical perspective, especially when deployed in unfriendly territory where the army would have to forage for supplies. These formations often served as the nucleus for larger armies, as additional allied contingents could be added if required. It was with such a force that Scipio sailed for the allied port of Massalia to begin the Roman invasion of Hispania. On his voyage he was accompanied by his brother, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, who had been consul in 222, and his teenage son and namesake, the future Scipio Africanus. It was typical for a Roman consul to bring a number of individuals along on campaign who did not hold a formal rank in the units they commanded. Calvus, and men like him, were trusted advisors to whom the consul could delegate power, giving them the rank of legatus if required. A legati could speak in the consul's voice in his absence, and could therefore be delegated any level of command. The younger men, such as the young Publius, were contubernali, or tent companions. These young noblemen formed a part of the consul's personal guard, and were deployed on campaign to gain military experience for their later careers. Upon arriving at Massalia, roughly halfway from Italy to Emporion, Scipio was greeted with the news that Hannibal had already advanced out of Spain and was marching quickly up the Rhone valley. The Roman consul attempted to give chase, but after a cavalry engagement it became clear that following Hannibal would be unwise. Scipio decided to delegate the command of his army to Calvus, and gave him orders to continue on to Emporion and begin operations against the Carthaginians. The consul returned to Italy with his personal staff, with the intention of taking command of the Roman forces in the Po Valley. Late in the year, Scipio would meet Hannibal around the Latin colony of Placentia. At the river Ticinus, he was badly wounded in a cavalry skirmish, and was only saved by the brave intervention of his 19-year-old son, Publius. Under the command of the other consul, Longus, the Romans were defeated in a hard-fought battle at the river Trebia. Many modern authors have claimed that the Romans' primary strategic objective in Spain was to ensure Hannibal would not receive any reinforcements from his brother Hasdrubal and the Carthaginian power base in Iberia. However, Scipio's decision to send his brother with a full consular army to campaign in Spain when Hannibal was already about to invade Italy is good evidence that this objective was never fundamental. If defeating Hannibal was Scipio's only objective, then returning to Italy without his forces does not seem to be a policy designed to achieve this aim. After all, if Hannibal's army was destroyed, interdicting reinforcements from Iberia would be a moot point. Had Longus had command of Scipio's army, plus the formidable forces already deployed in northern Italy, then the additional 20,000 men may have swung the balance at the Trebia, which was a close-run battle. Evidently, the Senate's fundamental policy in Iberia, from the very beginning of hostilities, was to destroy the Punic Empire in Spain. Hannibal was only one man, with one army, and even if he was defeated in Italy, with the massive resources available to Carthage in Iberia, there was no stopping other Punic commanders with other armies following in his footsteps. Calvus, in command of the Roman expeditionary force, landed at Emporion in 218. His consular army was supported by a considerable Roman fleet consisting of 60 quinqueremes, 3-decked warships. After going into winter quarters, campaigning began in the spring of 217. Livy's account of these operations is confused and contains some clear exaggerations. The Roman position in Spain was tiny, a small enclave around Emporion. Although their forces were not inconsequential, they were dwarfed by the Punic armies, which were probably around 3 times their strength. Indeed, upon their arrival in the northeast, Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother and the primary Punic commander in Spain, only detached a small contingent of 40 warships under Himilco to counter the Romans. Ancient warships were littoral vessels, and were generally not designed to be used for multi-day voyages. A trireme or quinquereme had a shallow draft, and typically the crews would beach them and camp overnight. At the mouth of the Ebro, the Punic force was caught while its ships were beached by the rapid advance of the Roman fleet. In a battle where only a portion of the Carthaginian ships were able to launch, most of the fleet was destroyed. In the wake of this victory, the Romans raided the Iberian coast, which Livy describes in glowing terms but was probably little more than a nuisance to the Carthaginians. It was late in the summer when the proconsul Publius Scipio, with his wounds healed after his defeat at the Ticinus, returned to the province with a supplementum, or reinforcement, of some 8,000 men and 30 ships. The 2 Scipio brothers were now united, and the Roman army had taken the Iberian city of Tarraco, further south along the coast from Emporion. This opera became the Roman base of operations in northern Iberia, and would remain so for the rest of the war. During this time, the Romans were approached by envoys of an unnamed Celtiberian tribe, who offered to attack the Carthaginians around the provincial capital of New Carthage. It was the intervention of the Celtiberians, rather than the Romans, that posed the greatest threat to Hasdrubal, who simply ignored Scipio and his enclave. Modern observers in general have a serious misconception of the war in Spain. Modern historians, especially popular writers, tend to treat the Spanish campaign as, primarily, a contest between Rome and Carthage, an Italian campaign with the roles reversed. But this was never the case, at least not until the campaign's very last stages. Punic forces in the theatre were always far greater than the Roman expeditionary force, and had they been able to concentrate on the eradication of the Roman enclave north of the Ebro, there is little reason to believe that they would not have been successful. The reason the Punic commanders were unable to focus on the Romans was because their attention was firmly fixed on their own borders. Spain was such an unstable country that numerous Punic armies were drawn from their provincial heartland in the coastal plains, up the river valleys towards Celtiberia and Lusitania, simply to try and prevent the constant attacks on their allies. All throughout the campaign, even to the Battle of Ilipa, one Punic army after another was sucked into punitive campaigns against various tribes, simply with the objective of establishing some level of deterrence. When these armies left the border areas, the incursions simply began again. Thus, the war in Spain was never really a Romano-Carthaginian conflict, but rather the story of one imperial power, later followed by the other, trying to establish a stable frontier. Until the arrival of Scipio Africanus, indeed, arguably as late as the Battle of Ilipa itself, the Romans were only ever one of many threats to the Punic position. This always needs to be remembered. In 215, after the great Punic victories of Lake Trasimene and Cannae, Hasdrubal decided to march to Italy and reinforce his brother there. However, in order to do so, he had to cross the Ebro and confront the Roman army around Tarraco. In a conventional clash of heavy infantry, the Carthaginian met the Scipio brothers in a massed battle along the lower Ebro valley. Livy's description of the engagement is unclear. It appears as though the forces were roughly equal in size, perhaps numbering around 30,000 men each. The Carthaginians deployed their heavy infantry line in 3 divisions. On the right were posted the Carthaginian infantry, in the centre the Iberians, and on the left wing stood the Africans. The Romans were deployed in the traditional triplex acies, or 3 lines. According to Livy's description of the battle, The Iberians in the centre essentially broke and fled the field without even engaging the Romans. The Carthaginians and Libyans, however, fought a protracted battle with the Roman wings, and were only overcome with great difficulty. This description sounds like an oversimplified exaggeration, as if the Punic centre had collapsed so completely, a rout would have surely ensued. Nonetheless, Livy emphasises that the Iberians had not fought with the vigour expected of them, and had indeed sabotaged Hasdrubal's hopes for the battle before it had begun. After this Roman victory, the fighting migrated south of the Ebro, into the land of the Iliturges. With at least one Carthaginian army operating against the Celtiberians, winning several unnamed battles, the Romans decided to operate aggressively and advance to Munda. There the Scipio brothers defeated Hasdrubal Gisco in a pitched battle, although no reliable details of the engagement have been recorded. It was unlikely to have been a major Punic defeat. By 212, the Romans had advanced as far south as Saguntum. This was little more than a symbolic victory, as the Senate had, at least superficially, gone to war with Carthage in Saguntum's defence. However, the Carthaginians were focused on their frontiers to the west, and, in reality, apart from keeping Hasdrubal in Spain, the Romans had achieved little of strategic merit, despite their tactical successes. In 211, the Scipios made a fateful decision. They had brought several Iberian tribes of the northeast into alliance with Rome, and over the winter had raised a force of some 20,000 Iberian auxiliaries, doubling the heavy infantry available to them. With such resources, a decisive campaign could now be waged. The Scipio brothers would divide their forces and bring the primary Punic armies in the province to battle simultaneously. The Punic forces in Spain were divided into 3 field armies. The first of these, under the command of Hasdrubal Barca, was encamped at Amtorges, an oppida of the Oretani. The other 2, under the command of Hasdrubal Gisco and Mago respectively, were concentrated just 5 days' march from the Roman camp. The proconsul Publius would take 2/3 of the Italian infantry and advance upon Hasdrubal and Mago, while Calvus would take the bulk of the Iberians, supported by only 1 legion of Italians, and engage Hasdrubal Barca at Amtorges. Publius marched with the bulk of the army towards Hasdrubal, Gisco, and Mago. As was typical, he placed his camp on a hilltop close to the Carthaginians, and began to forage for water and supplies, with the intent of fighting a battle in the coming days. However, the situation which faced the Romans was far from typical. It is rare in warfare that a single commander and a single unit can change the whole tactical and operational circumstance of entire armies, but Scipio faced just such a man. Massinissa, the young Libyan prince, had arrived from Numidia at the head of several thousand Numidian cavalry to support his Punic allies, and was now under the command of Hasdrubal Gisco. The Numidian horse was legendary, and Massinissa was, arguably, one of the greatest cavalry commanders the ancient world had ever seen. The Numidians were master horsemen who were lightly armoured and rode bareback. On the battlefield, their ability to manoeuvre was unparalleled, and at an operational level, they could move vast distances quickly. Their presence immediately put an end to any Roman foraging. Any group who left the camp were quickly surrounded and showered with javelins or cut down. Without access to water or firewood, the situation inside the Roman camp grew desperate, and anxiety only deepened upon word that a Celtiberian chieftain, Indelibilis, was en route with 7,500 reinforcements. In a desperate gamble, Publius led the bulk of the army on a midnight march to intercept the Celtiberians. As the warm sunrise lifted the cover of darkness, Scipio found himself pinned between the Celtiberians, Numidians, and the Carthaginian army which had broken camp in pursuit. Although the Romans formed a defensive line and tried to fight, Scipio was struck by a lance in his left side, a wound that proved immediately fatal. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the consul of 218, and a man who had served Rome faithfully for most of his adult life, including being wounded badly at the Ticinus, had fallen. With his death, the Roman position collapsed and the army was destroyed and dispersed. At Amtorgis, Calvus faced a very different set of challenges. As he encamped close to the Carthaginians, Hasdrubal became aware that the bulk of the army was composed of Iberians. Hasdrubal, son of Hamilcar, proved to be an excellent politician and strategist, perhaps better than he was as a general. He immediately sent Iberian spies into the Roman camp to begin secret negotiations with the Iberian commanders. A simple lump sum payment was all it took to detach these men from their Roman allies. With no warning, the Iberians simply broke camp and marched towards their homeland, and with such a small force of Italians there was nothing the Romans could do to stop them. Without his allies, Calvus was desperately exposed. He had, perhaps, 10,000 Italians under his command. He took the only option available to him, flight. Under the cover of darkness, and in light order, the Romans abandoned their camp and began a rapid march for Tarraco, perhaps a week away. Calvus was quick enough to catch Hasdrubal wrong-footed, and succeeded in opening up a 24-hour gap between the two armies. However, Massinissa again decided the Romans' fate. After joining with Hasdrubal Barca's army, the Numidians quickly rode down the fleeing Romans. Although Massinissa could not inflict severe casualties on Calvus's forces, the Romans were forced to stop and face the Numidians, allowing the bulk of the Punic army to rapidly close the gap. In a final, desperate battle, the Romans made a camp built of horse saddles on a small hill and tried to hold off the onslaught. Calvus was killed in the first charge, and the Roman army was defeated. Only darkness prevented the army's entire destruction. Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, the consul of 222 and the commander of the war with the Insurbs, had, like his brother 29 days before, fallen. The Battle of the Upper Baetis had been lost. The rise of Scipio Africanus. The campaign of 211 was nothing more than an unmitigated disaster for the Romans. Both commanders had been badly outmaneuvered at the political, operational, and tactical levels. Publius simply could not deal with the tactical dexterity of the Numidians, and had reacted by leading his army to its demise in an ill-conceived and panicky night action. Calvus had been defeated before he even drew his sword. The two Roman commanders, and indeed practically all of the tribunes, were dead, and with them about half of the Roman army had been killed or captured. The survivors were now under the command of a young equestrian who had been elected general by the army, Lucius Marcius, an indication of just how bad the command casualties had been. Marcius was holding the Roman enclave north of the Ebro, but all gains south of the river had been lost. In Italy, the situation was improving. The Romans had finally retaken Capua, and the great city of Syracuse had fallen to Marcellus. The Senate was willing to allocate the resources required to continue the campaign in Spain, but they also needed a commander of proconsular rank. Livy claims that many great names were put forward, although, suspiciously, he does not say which, and the Senate could simply not pick a candidate. Thus, they deferred the decision to the people, and the consuls were directed to hold an election for the position of proconsul in command of the Spanish theatre. On the day of the elections, not a single member of the Senate, nor any commander who had held the rank of praetor or above, stood for election. The only candidate who raised his hand that day was the 24-year-old son of Publius Cornelius Scipio, the young Scipio Africanus. The election of Scipio to the rank of proconsul was extremely unusual. A proconsul was, within his province, only outranked by the consuls themselves. The Roman political system required that its politicians and administrators follow a 20-year career in military and administrative positions before the most senior officers were made available. This process, called the cursus honorum, or the path of honour, was a ladder of increasing responsibility, each rank of which was limited by age. A young nobleman would need to spend a decade in the military, eventually reaching the rank of military tribune, middle-ranking officers. Then, after this service was complete, at 30 he was eligible for the first rank of public administrative office, the quaestor. Quaestors were purely administrative positions which held no imperium. Then, at the age of 36, he was eligible to run for the office of aedile, higher-ranking administrative positions in the city of Rome, which included responsibility for administering the temples, public buildings, and games. At 39, the rank of praetor became available. Praetors were, in a sense, junior consuls. They held imperium and could command armies. They were attended by 6 lictors, those responsible for handing out physical punishment, and functioned as the city's judges. Only then, after 2 decades of public service and at the ripe age of 42, could a man run for the supreme office, consul. Typically, the rank of proconsul was given to the consuls whose year of office had expired but were still on campaign. The young Africanus had served as a military tribune of the 2nd Legion at Cannae. However, the highest administrative rank he had achieved was being elected aedile in 213, an election which was challenged due to his very young age. The cursus honorum was designed to ensure that those men who were given the enormous responsibility of commanding the Republic's armies were well prepared for the great burden of high office, specifically by ensuring a lifetime of military and administrative experience. Africanus was only 24 and had never held a command of any independent fighting formation. The fact that not a single ex-praetor or ex-consul could be found who was able or willing to take the command is evidence of just how devastating the war had been on the Roman aristocracy. The reserve of trained and experienced leadership is a key element in a nation's military potential, and the losses at Cannae, Trasimene, and the Upper Baetis, in addition to the massive forces the Romans already had in the field, had bled the nobility white. His election was a sign of just how desperate the war had become for Rome. In 210, Africanus set sail for Emporion with a fleet of 30 quinqueremes. The Senate authorized him to raise a supplementum of 10,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, bringing his total command up to a full-strength consular army. After landing, he marched overland to Tarraco and concentrated his forces. His father had founded a Latin colony in the former Oppida, and this served as the Roman base of operations in Spain. Scipio spent the winter training his men and improving his situational awareness. He took deputations from many surrounding tribes, and both Polybius and Livy describe a period of detailed intelligence gathering concerning the nature of the country, the dispositions of the Carthaginians, and the events that led to his father and uncle's death. Africanus faced the same challenges as his forebears. Before him lay a vast Punic empire, riddled with fortified towns and fearsome tribes. The Carthaginian forces were roughly 3 to 4 times his strength, concentrated in 3 field armies, each of which was comparable to his own. However, there were opportunities. As had been the case throughout the war, once the Carthaginians concentrated their forces in one part of the peninsula, their borders became unstable elsewhere. Only the presence of a Punic army could prevent Lusitanian or Celtiberian raiding. This is why only Hasdrubal Gisco followed up the Punic victory at the Upper Baetis, allowing the Romans to effectively defend their enclave around Tarraco. The other 2 armies were immediately drawn away to other areas of the frontier. During the winter of 210 to 209, these same pressures forced the 3 Punic armies to camp in distant parts of the empire. Hasdrubal Gisco had withdrawn to Gades in order to cover the Lusitanians. Mago was camped even farther west in the land of the Conii, and Hasdrubal Barca had been drawn into the central highlands and was besieging an oppida of the Carpetani. Obviously, none of the Punic commanders viewed the recently defeated Romans as any kind of threat, as all 3 were over a week's march away from the coastal heartlands of the Punic province. Indeed, Hasdrubal, the closest of the 3 Carthaginian commanders, was 10 days' march from the Punic capital, New Carthage. Scipio formed a plan of operations that was, if nothing else, stunning in its audacity. He intended to make a lightning assault on New Carthage while it was undefended, and take it before anyone could march to its defense. That gave him roughly 10 days to take a fortified city. The siege of Saguntum had taken Hannibal 8 months and several assaults, and he had massive forces in comparison to Scipio. Syracuse had withstood Marcellus for nearly a year. If Scipio could not take the city in 10 days, he was likely to be pinned between its defenders and Hasdrubal Barca, who would surely respond rapidly to a siege. Making the challenge more formidable was the construction of the city itself. Carthago Nova was sited on a hilly isthmus which protruded into the Bay of Cartagena. It was protected by water on 3 sides, with a lagoon to the north and the bay to the south. It was named New Carthage because of its harbour, which, like its mother city, was excellent and one of the best in Spain. Its one, short, landward side, about 2 stades or 350 metres in width, was protected by formidable fortifications, high stone walls and towers. Its 4,000 defenders could easily concentrate on this short line. To take such a fortification within a week, without the aid of treachery, would be an unparalleled achievement. However, New Carthage was a glittering prize if it could be taken. Most of the Carthaginian treasury was located there, and the city was full of artisans and smiths, which produced much of the Carthaginian war material. Perhaps more critically, the city was full of noble hostages. A core element in the Punic alliance system was the taking of hostages. Typically, the Carthaginians would demand that the relatives of a tribe's leadership, usually sons or daughters of the nobleman, would be interned and placed under Punic protection. These individuals were not treated as prisoners and were free to lead lives of luxury in the city. However, they were not free to leave, and their lives would be forfeit if their tribe did not honour its treaties with Carthage. Releasing these prisoners would seriously undermine the stability of the Carthaginian alliance system throughout Spain. Polybius spends a lot of time describing the extensive intelligence-gathering activities undertaken by Scipio. He had questioned fishermen, traders, deserters, and allies, and by the end of the winter had built a detailed picture of the city, its defences, the terrain, and the positions of the various Carthaginian armies. Attacking Carthago Nova may have been a gamble, but it was not done blind. After months of planning, training, and preparation, in the spring of 209, Scipio put his plans into action. Polybius claims that only 2 people knew of his operational dispositions, Africanus himself and his trusted subordinate Gaius Laelius, who commanded the Roman fleet. Laelius set sail from the mouth of the Ebro with a force of more than 30 quinqueremes and orders to arrive at New Carthage in 1 week. Strengthened by a contingent of 5,000 Iberian allies, Africanus crossed the Ebro and advanced on the city. After a 6-day march, he arrived outside the city gates with a total force of 25,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, and encamped a few hundred metres from the walls. The battlements were formidable, and Polybius states that the walls were exceptionally high. The city was defended by about 4,000 infantry, 1,000 of which were professional soldiers, with the remnant formed by the town militia. As the first Roman wave, consisting of 2,000 men, began to form up close to the camp, the Punic commander, Mago, ordered the militia to sally forth from the main gate and attack the Romans while they were disordered. Scipio was in the process of issuing ladders when the defenders rushed out of the city and attacked. The contest was apparently even for some time, an indication that Scipio was caught off guard. But the close proximity of the camp allowed the Roman commanders to steadily feed reinforcements into the battle. After some hard fighting, the militiamen fell back to the city in disorder, with many trampled whilst trying to get back through the gate. Now able to concentrate on the walls, the Romans advanced. Scipio had promised civic crowns, the Romans' highest battle honour, to the first man over the walls, and the initial attack was made with vigour. The morale of the men was high, but so were the walls. Polybius describes ladders breaking under the weight of so many men, individual legionaries falling to their death simply from vertigo, and the defenders using logs to crush whole stacks of infantry. The attack was hard-pressed, but failed to make headway, and after some time, Scipio called the retreat and withdrew back to his camp. The initial assault had tested the defences, which had proved formidable. However, the defenders' missile stocks were now low. Scipio formed up for a second assault, with more ladders and more men. He advanced to the walls in person. With 3 legionaries covering him with their shields, he could closely observe the action. The time was now approaching midday, and the tide was falling. By talking to local fishermen earlier in the year, Scipio had learned that the lagoon was in fact fordable at low tide. He had detached a picked force of 500 heavy infantry to move around the lagoon and find a place to cross. In the middle they indeed found a sandbar and waded through the waist-deep water. On the far side they were greeted by a stretch of wall without a single defender. Every last man had been drawn to defend the gates and the assault from the sea. By concentrating the defenders around the gate, the assault on the walls had achieved its aim, and by careful preparation, Africanus had unlocked the city's back door. The legionaries quickly and quietly ascended the wall without a single casualty. These heavily armed men swept along the wall towards the gate, and as Roman panoply was excellent for this kind of fighting, they easily killed any defenders they met in the confined quarters. Cutting their way to the gate, they hacked through the bolts. With the gates in Roman control, more maniples were sent into the city, with orders to kill anything in sight. Scipio led a detachment of 1,000 men through the gates directly towards the citadel. Upon his approach, Mago surrendered and the city was spared farther bloodshed. Carthago Nova was a great victory. The Romans had taken a fortified city, indeed the capital of Punic Spain, in one day's fighting. At a single blow, Scipio now had the funds, more than 600 talents of silver, and the economic capacities to support farther campaigns without relying upon Rome. He could pay his men and equip them with locally manufactured arms. He had also severely shaken Punic prestige. Just 2 years before, the Romans were an utterly defeated force. Now they had taken the Punic jewel in a coup de main. Most critically, Scipio now had control of the Punic hostages. Polybius and Livy write of the great nobility Scipio displayed at this juncture, treating them all with great respect and giving them gifts, even turning down a beautiful young woman who was brought to him by some younger legionaries. The historicity of these stories is probably doubtful, but we can be sure that he told them all to write to their families and convey the message that all of them would be returned to their homelands if their tribes would become the friends of Rome. Many sent deputations to the proconsul, and had their family members returned to them, including the leader of the Editani, Edico, who came to the Roman winter camp at Tarraco to beg for the return of his wife and children. Edico and Africanus became fast friends, and, after spending some weeks at Tarraco as the proconsul's guest, the Iberian returned to his home with his young family. The Carthaginians were completely caught off guard. As far as we can tell, the first time Hasdrubal Barca heard that Carthago Nova was under threat was when news arrived of its capture. The impact on his army was immediate. 2 Iberian princes, Andobales and Mandonius, whose wives and children Hasdrubal had forcefully interned as hostages, immediately left the Punic army and defected to the Romans, meeting Scipio near Tarraco. After having their family returned to them, the Iberians signed a formal alliance with Rome and placed their armies under Roman command. Hasdrubal was now exposed. A significant portion of his force had now defected to his enemy, and the other Punic armies were several weeks' march west, still dealing with the Lusitanians. He was operating in the central highlands, around the town of Baecula, and decided to move his camp to a good defensive position, the summit of El Cerro de las Albahacas, just south of the modern town of Santo Tomé. Albahacas is a very imposing terrain feature. The mountain rises above the surrounding valleys by several hundred meters, has steep slopes on 2 sides, and a series of terrace-like features to its south. In the campaigning season of 208, Scipio decided to engage Hasdrubal Barca, whose army was the closest to Tarraco. Neither of the major sources cite the strength of the Roman army for the campaign of 208, but we can be certain that Africanus had all of his Italian forces. Hasdrubal's army was probably between 20 and 30,000 strong, accounting for the recent Iberian defections. Africanus advanced rapidly into the land of the Oritani. However, the strength of Hasdrubal's defensive position stopped him in his tracks. The Carthaginians' fortified camp was positioned so well it seemed all but impregnable. Marching camps were widely utilized by ancient armies because of the immense defensive benefits they provided. With a ditch and a wooden palisade, a well-equipped army was more than capable of defending itself from superior forces, and Hasdrubal's camp was well watered and protected by terrain. Scipio encamped relatively close, but could not compel Hasdrubal to leave his entrenchments. After 2 days of inconclusive skirmishing, Africanus decided to act. If he continued to wait, there was every possibility that one of the other armies would march to Hasdrubal's defence. But attacking a camp in a daylight assault, or indeed simply an enemy that held such a strong defensive terrain feature, was not generally considered a sound plan of operations. Typically, ancient commanders would expend much effort to ensure that a battle would be fought on, at least, neutral flat ground. Confronted with such a position, it is safe to say that most ancient commanders would have simply withdrawn and attempted to re-engage at a later time. Nonetheless, Africanus decided on another audacious plan. In the morning, he would attack the Carthaginians on their hilltop, but he would rely on speed and manoeuvre to offset their superior position. Africanus was a master of manoeuvre warfare, where Hannibal's genius lay in his ability to utilize formation and terrain to ambush his enemies. Scipio's real talent was in the rapid manoeuvre of massed heavy infantry formations. Typically, armies fought reasonably static encounters, attritional battles of massed heavy infantry lines with the objective of grinding down the enemy. Africanus would utilize heavy infantry manoeuvre to gain positional advantages over his enemies. He had used a surprise flank attack to secure New Carthage, but at Baecula he would employ manoeuvre on a grand scale. Hasdrubal was in the habit of deploying his light infantry on the crest of the summit as a covering force, while remaining with the bulk of the army inside the camp. Scipio made his battle plans on the evening of the second day. He would attack the enemy light infantry on the ridge with his velites, with the aim of pinning them and drawing out the Punic army. Then, once this aim had been achieved, he would split the heavy infantry into 2 columns, 1 legion and supporting ala each, and march rapidly around the 2 flanks of his light infantry screen, through a gully on either side of the field, and trap the Punic heavy infantry in a pincer. Scipio would lead 1 legion, Laelius the other. If he could be fast enough, he could get his heavy infantry up onto the flat ground around the Punic camp before Hasdrubal had formed a battle line. It was an audacious plan. If the Romans were too slow, they would be caught on the steep slopes with their heavy infantry divided, inviting a defeat in detail. Everything rested on speed and surprise. At dawn on the 3rd morning, Africanus ordered his men to breakfast, and then formed up his 2 legions into 2 columns inside the camp. He then sent a detachment of velites, supported by 1,000 heavy infantry, to attack directly up the slope and engage the light infantry screen on the ridgeline. The attachment of 1,000 heavy infantry was designed to give the light infantry a firm base to retreat behind, so they could regroup, and provided key combined arms benefits. The morale of the men was high, and the velites performed well. By now, Scipio's consular army was fit, battle-hardened, and well-trained. It was capable of a rapid march, steadfast defense, and the execution of detailed, technical maneuver. The ferocity of the attack in the center produced the desired result. Reports came back to the Roman camp that Hasdrubal had begun to deploy his heavy infantry line. Now was the moment. Instantly the Romans exploded into action. The rest of the light infantry was ordered to support the center, and the 2 legions began advancing. By moving in column, the heavy infantry was able to advance much faster than by moving in line, and by utilizing the gullies, a good portion of the approach was covered. In short order, the leading maniples crested the hilltop on either flank, with Africanus and Laelius at their heads. Before them lay half the Punic army outside the camp, still disordered and yet to form a line of battle, and the other half still moving from their tents. Polybius states that Hasdrubal was slow to deploy his main force because he simply did not think the Romans would attack such a strong position, which is probably an understandable, if unfortunate, attitude to take. Scipio Africanus was, after all, no ordinary commander. The 2 legions were able to quickly form a line of battle on the flat ground at the summit. They attacked the Punic heavy infantry, discharging their javelins and advancing behind their shields. Critically, the Punic formation, disordered as it was, faced south, with the aim of supporting the light infantry. The Roman pincers crashed into the flanks, and the shock and speed of the sudden envelopment spread panic through the heavy infantry line. Many were slaughtered as they tried to retreat to the camp, only to become confused with the units which we were attempting to deploy. Hasdrubal was now in a hopeless situation. With his light infantry cut off and half his heavy infantry fleeing for their lives, there was no hope of winning this battle. With the elephants, cavalry, treasury, and as much infantry as he could muster, he immediately retreated down the north slope of the hill. The presence of the camp and the surviving Carthaginian forces at the gates gave Hasdrubal just enough time to escape total annihilation. Indeed, as slow as he had been to react to Scipio's attack, his withdrawal in the face of the Romans showed great ability. He rapidly retreated up the Tagus River into friendly Celtiberia. About half the army was captured or killed. Livy states that about 10,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry were captured. If we surmise another 5,000 killed, that would leave a remnant of around 10,000, assuming his force was roughly equal to the Romans in strength. Among the prisoners were a large group of Numidians, including a young boy, who just so happened to be Massinis's nephew, a boy he had raised as his own. Upon learning who the youth was, Scipio presented him with gifts, a fine horse, and a cavalry bodyguard, with orders to take the boy wherever he wanted. This simple act of clemency would have serious repercussions for the remainder of the war. Scipio decided not to follow Hasdrubal north. Both Polybius and Livy state that the primary reason for not following Hasdrubal was a concern that the other armies would concentrate their forces. Scipio always had to operate against elements of his enemy's forces. He was never strong enough to face them all in battle. Although not mentioned by Polybius, Livy claims that the three Punic armies indeed all met in Celtiberia following the battle, which, if true, would substantiate Scipio's concerns. According to the Libyan narrative, the three Carthaginians decided on the following plan of operations. Hasdrubal Barca was reinforced with a large contingent of Iberians from Mago's army, as these were now seen to be untrustworthy, bringing his formation up to strength. He would then leave Hispania and follow in his brother's footsteps, through Gaul, across the Alps, and attempt to join Hannibal in southern Italy. Mago would travel to the Balearics to raise new mercenary forces, and the remainder of his army would be placed under Hasdrubal Gisco's command, who would remain in Hispania and face Scipio. Many modern scholars have been critical of Scipio for allowing Hasdrubal to escape after Baecula. They argue that the primary strategic objective underpinning the Spanish campaign was the interdiction of reinforcements. If this is the case, then this was undeniably a failure on Scipio's part. But just how much of a failure was this? How much of a threat did Hasdrubal pose to the Romans in Italy? By this time in the war, Hannibal had been pushed all the way back to Bruttium. Capua, Tarentum, and many other cities had fallen to the Romans. When Hasdrubal reached Cisalpine Gaul, he had about 20,000 men, and was reinforced by around 10,000 Celts. Given their performance at the Metaurus, these were not the boy's finest warriors, most of which had already joined the Carthaginians in 217. Had this force succeeded in reaching Hannibal, what could he have achieved with it? During the height of the war, Livy cites the mobilization of 27 legions, which equates to around 300,000 men if allied contingents are considered. By simply shadowing Hannibal and attacking his allies, the Romans had been quite successful at regaining a large amount of territory. Would an additional 30 to 40,000 reinforcements have changed that metric? It is hard to see how, especially this late in the war. Given the above, and how easily Hasdrubal was defeated at the Metaurus, this failure has, arguably, been overstated. In any case, it simply may not have been a practical possibility. Additionally, given the actions of the Scipio brothers, it seems as though the Senate's ultimate objective was always the destruction of the Punic power base in Spain, not simply the interdiction of reinforcements, and leaving Spain to follow Hasdrubal was unlikely to achieve this greater aim. Ilipa, the final battle. The campaign of 208 had transformed the Roman position in Spain. Most of the Iberian tribes of the east were now firmly in alliance with Rome, and Scipio now commanded substantial military potential. However, the western half of the Punic Empire, focused on the Turdetani and Turduli, was still intact. Hasdrubal Gisco still commanded a large force, in excess of 40,000, and the Carthaginians had reinforced their position with a fresh formation under Hanno. The campaigning season of 207 was inconclusive and comparably uneventful, with both armies operating in Celtiberia. The Carthaginians clearly spent much of 207 gathering their forces, which explains much of the inactivity. In the spring of 206, Hasdrubal Gisco, the supreme Punic commander in Spain, gave orders for the army to return from its dispersed winter quarters and to concentrate under his command. The total force the Carthaginians compiled was massive. Polybius, usually a trustworthy source when describing the size of armies, records a total strength of 70,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 32 elephants. This was a gargantuan formation. Typical strength for Carthaginian field armies in Spain was between 30 and 40,000. Although logistical constraints probably inhibited any further growth, this force most likely constituted practically all of the Carthaginians' military potential in Hispania. Mago had returned with a force of Balearic infantry, although Libby claims that these units were very inexperienced and poorly trained. It was Hasdrubal Gisco's final roll of the dice. His intentions were clear: to mobilize all the forces he could muster and draw Scipio into a battle where his numbers would count for more than the Romans' generalship. In this sense, it was the same operational plan utilized by the Romans prior to the Battle of Cannae. With this mighty army, Hasdrubal marched to the town of Ilipa in the land of the Turdetani, near modern Seville. There, he encamped on ground that was likely to precipitate a battle, a low hill with a wide plain to its front. Upon hearing of Hasdrubal's advance, Scipio concentrated his forces. To this point in the campaign, he had only relied upon his Italian units. Allied contingents were neither a large element of his army, nor were they given critical tasks. But this was different. Awaiting him at Ilipa was one of the largest field armies the war had seen. Indeed, the scale of Hasdrubal's force was only second to the Roman host at Cannae. Scipio's Consular Army was, by this time, exceptional. It had been with him since 209, and some of the men had enrolled in 218. By years of training, campaigning and victory, Africanus had forged his Italians into a finely honed instrument, an elite imperial guard. They were easily the equal of any formation of the Hannibalic War. But these men only numbered 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. Africanus had no choice. He had to risk the fate of his uncle Calvus and rely upon Iberians. As he broke his winter quarters and marched south, through the lands of the Edetani and Oretani, he gathered allied contingents as he advanced. By the time it reached Ilipa, the Roman army had swollen to 45,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry. Scipio's infantry was probably composed of around 3/4 heavy infantry, 1/4 light infantry. The Iberians, mostly Scutati, formed around half of his total infantry strength. As Scipio approached Ilipa, he chose to position the camp across the plain from the Carthaginians. Hoping to catch the Romans whilst they were entrenching, Mago attacked, leading the whole Punic cavalry, including Massinissa and the Numidians, across the plain. As the cavalry charged up the far side of the valley, they found the Romans waiting for them. Scipio had formed units covering the men who were building the camp, and in the shadow of a small hill, he had hidden his whole cavalry force in reserve. On the appearance of the Carthaginians, the Roman horse fell on their flank, throwing them into rapid disorder. Polybius mentions the ability of the Roman horsemen to swiftly dismount and fight as infantry as a particular problem for the Carthaginians. The Punic horse retreated and were pushed back to the camp. These kinds of skirmishes may seem inconsequential, and surely the losses on both sides would have been light. However, they did have a real impact on the morale of both sides. If one army was seen to win these minor encounters, it was perceived that they had the upper hand. At some point, these men would have to face each other in battle, with nothing more than their swords and shields to separate them. Any morale advantage could have a substantial impact on the outcome of the engagement. After this initial clash of cavalry, the Romans were free to complete their camp. The next morning, at what Polybius calls a late hour, Hasdrubal deployed his forces. Behind the light infantry and cavalry, the Carthaginians deployed their heavy infantry line on good defensive ground just before their own palisade. Hasdrubal's formation was conventional, with his elite Africans in the centre and the Iberians divided on each wing. Both the ancient narratives describe the Iberians as inferior units in both the Punic and Roman armies. This should not be taken as evidence of their capability as fighting formations, but only their resolve. Properly led and motivated, Iberian Scutati were extremely capable heavy infantry. But in the Spanish campaign, defection was always a possibility. Both sides had been stung by Iberian intransigence, and thus placed their greatest trust in their own countrymen. At what Polybius describes as a later hour, Africanus deployed the Roman army in an analogous position before the Roman camp. In the centre, he placed his Italians in standard formation, with the Aule on either wing of the legions. To the flanks of the Aule, the Scutati were deployed, equally divided. There the armies stood, staring at each other as the afternoon passed. Over 100,000 fighting men in battle formation, their armour glistening in the sun, the bright red crests of the Roman centurions blowing in the wind, and the foreboding presence of the elephants in the centre of the field, which Livy describes as towers looming in the distance. It must have been quite a sight. This pattern continued for several days. The Carthaginians would deploy first, usually quite late in the morning. The Romans would follow, and the heavy infantry lines would just look at each other as the day passed. The cavalry and infantry would skirmish, although the losses from these skirmishes were undoubtedly light, as a major engagement of the light infantry would have probably precipitated a battle. Then, as the sun grew dim and the hour grew late, Hasdrubal would withdraw his men to the camp. The Romans would do the same. It is, perhaps, hard for a modern observer to understand this kind of pageantry. Why would two armies simply stare at each other? Clearly, both had come to Ilipa to do battle. The answer lies in the unwillingness of either commander to sacrifice the advantage of terrain. Although the battlefield at Ilipa was not particularly hilly, even a small rise was a defensive benefit, and neither Scipio nor Hasdrubal was willing to relinquish this advantage. On the evening of the third or fourth day, Scipio decided to force a battle. Hasdrubal had been given ample opportunity to attack with his overwhelming force. Clearly he had no intention of doing so. This was Scipio's chance to end the Spanish campaign and eradicate the Carthaginian Empire. Effectively, every Carthaginian in Spain was across that field. He may not get another opportunity for such a decisive engagement. That night, he gave orders that the men were to wake before dawn and breakfast early. Calling a concilium, or council of war, he summoned his senior officers, Laelius and Silanus, and the leaders of his Iberian allies, such as Edico, and informed them of his plans. At first light, he intended to send the cavalry and light infantry to attack the Carthaginian camp, while simultaneously deploying the main battle line. This time, the Iberians would take the centre of the formation. The two Roman legions, supported by the Aule, would be placed on the flanks, with one wing commanded by Africanus and the other by Laelius. The Iberians were ordered to attack in line at a walking pace, and, if possible, not to commit to melee combat if this could be avoided. The Romans would advance rapidly, in column, and fall upon the Iberians on the flanks. The next morning the tribunes woke the men before dawn, ordering them all to eat a good meal and prepare their weapons. The camp was a hive of activity, as the centurions formed up the maniples inside the rampart, and the equites tended to their horses. At first light Scipio gave the order. The velites, equites, and allied cavalry were to attack the enemy outposts around the Punic camp. Behind them marched the whole Roman army, which advanced down into the flat ground below the enemy entrenchments. Hasdrubal was stunned by the sudden assault. Inside the Carthaginian camp, chaos reigned. The men were relaxing around their campfires and tents when the outpost screamed for help. Immediately the officers sprang to action, as the men hurriedly found their positions in the formation. Without any time to eat, they were ordered out of the camp as Hasdrubal deployed the heavy infantry line. The heavy infantry advanced behind the light infantry and cavalry to the same position they had taken the day before. Upon this advance, the Roman cavalry and light infantry retreated and took their positions in the Roman formation. The Romans were close, perhaps just 2 kilometers away. As the sun rose and the light grew brighter, it became clear that they had altered their formation. The Italians were now on the flanks opposing his Spaniards. However, it was far too late to change his own formation. The resulting disorder would only invite disaster. With the Punic army deployed for battle, Scipio waited. He knew their men would be hungry, and they could not alter their formation with the Roman forces so close. He took no action until around the 7th hour, allowing hunger to grow in the Punic army. Again, this may seem like a minor advantage, the lack of breakfast. However, one has to remember just how taxing edged weapon combat was. Any advantage was worth accruing, and hungry men could not fight for as long as well-fed legionaries. At midday, he gave the order to advance. The velites and other light infantry, which had been skirmishing between the heavy infantry formations, retreated through the gaps in the maniples and took their place behind the line. The Iberians in the centre, 20,000 men deployed in a conventional line of battle, began their advance at a slow walking pace, screaming their war cry and banging their shields as they moved. The Romans on the wings followed suit, keeping pace with the Iberians, and the whole army, 45,000 strong, advanced in line. The Carthaginians prepared for the coming attack, and although it is hard to tell from either Polybius or Livy's description of the battle, it seems as though Hasdrubal moved his elephants to the flanks. It was the only unit he had available to reinforce his Iberians. When the two opposing battle arrays were about 4 stades apart, roughly 1 kilometer, the Romans initiated the battle-winning manoeuvre. The set of manoeuvres executed by the Romans at Ilipa were, arguably, the most technically complex seen in the Second Punic War. Indeed, one could argue that a comparably complicated and precise set of manoeuvres would not be executed by a Roman army for over a century. To understand the action at Ilipa and what made it unique, we first need to understand the typical Roman method of operations and large unit formation. Roman heavy infantry of the mid-Republic were divided into 3 classes. The first division, the hastati, were typically men in their 20s. They were armed with a large oval shield, several light javelins, or pila, and the short Spanish sword. Their armour consisted of a large brass breastplate, a brass or iron helmet, and greaves. The next division was the principes, or those in the prime of life, typically aged in their 30s. These men were comparably equipped to the hastati, but generally wore a mail shirt called a lorica. The third division, the triarii, were the most experienced, men in their 40s, and wore the same armour as the principes, but swapped the javelins for a long hoplite spear. Originally, these 3 divisions represented economic classes, as the men had to pay for their own arms. However, by this period the men were primarily divided by age and experience, as the state would provide this equipment and deduct the cost from the legionary's salary. Typically, the 3 divisions would form ranks in a 3-layered order of battle, called the 3 lines, arranged in maniples of 120 men. These maniples would be deployed in a staggered formation, called the quincunx, as it resembled the number 5 on a gaming die. The hastati maniples would maintain gaps between the frontline units of roughly their own width. These gaps would be covered by a mantle of principes in the second line, which would maintain the same gaps between units. The third line, the triarii, would cover the gaps in the second. Typical Roman doctrine would utilize this formation to grind down opposing battle arrays. By steadily rotating maniples, the Romans were able to constantly feed fresh men into the battle, who were of steadily increasing quality. This gave their line immense staying power. The Romans were able to maintain gaps between the frontline units because the fighting was discontinuous. Ancient warfare looked nothing like the movies. Sword-to-shield fighting would occur in short, sharp bursts, and the formation would be maintained at all costs. Remaining in formation was a matter of life and death for any ancient soldier. This meant that the actual time small units came into contact was short. They would retreat a small distance between these battle pulses, only to re-engage again a short time later. Additionally, much of the heavy infantry combat was actually conducted with missiles, which is why the typical Roman maniple had such a large supply of pillar. This formation was very capable in a frontal assault, however it was cumbersome during manoeuvre. The individual legion had 30 maniples, each of which had its own commander, the centurion. The manoeuvre Scipio planned at Ilipa required each legion to turn from line of battle to column, with the ends of the line now becoming the head of the column, turn 90 degrees, and march at the run towards the enemy battle array, then, almost within javelin range, wheel back into line again. With 30 subunits within each legion, this was an invitation to disorder. If the formation broke down, the Romans would be extremely vulnerable. To address this problem, Africanus utilized a new formation, the cohort. Although probably in use with the army for some time, Polybius first describes this formation at Ilipa. The cohort, as used by Africanus, was an ad hoc battle group, comprised of 3 maniples, one from each of the heavy infantry divisions. Probably commanded by the senior centurion of the triarii, these cohorts had enough mass to conduct small-scale combined arms battle by forming a 2-maniple front with 1 in reserve. Additionally, by formalizing the relationship between the 3 maniples, Africanus gave senior centurions the independent authority to utilize their initiative if the situation demanded. For example, if the enemy line advanced as the attack column was approaching, the lead cohort could rapidly deploy for battle, forcing the Carthaginians to engage it. This would provide cover for the following cohorts to deploy. By imposing order at the level of the cohort, Africanus substantially increased the legion's resistance to disorder during manoeuvre. It is more than probable that the alae were organized in exactly the same way. At Ilipa, the 2 Roman legions and their supporting alae turned towards the wings and formed 4 columns, one of each infantry division, and the rear column comprised of the cavalry and light infantry. These 4 elements marched as one large column, with each cohort following the other, first towards the end of the line, and then making a 90-degree turn, all following the first cohort's path. Advancing at the run, the lead cohort moved directly towards the termination of the enemy heavy infantry line. Polybius gives the distance as 4 states, or about 800 to 1,000 meters. Assuming they moved at a steady jog, the lead cohort could have closed this distance in about 6 minutes. As the lead cohort arrived at its appointed position, it deployed its 3 maniples into battle formation. Behind it, the next cohort wheeled towards the center, taking its place beside the first cohort. The next cohort in the column then deployed inside the second. In this manner, the whole legion pivoted behind the lead cohort, swinging like a great gate towards the center, presenting the 3 lines again. This whole process should have taken less than 15 minutes, with the rear cohort having to move the greatest distance, about 2 kilometers. As the heavy infantry cohorts wheeled towards the center, the 4th, rearmost line, consisting of the velites and cavalry, wheeled in the opposite direction. Pivoting behind the lead cohort, the light infantry swung towards the flanks, enveloping the enemy line. This process was mirrored on both wings. One question raised by the Roman maneuvers at Ilipa is the inactivity of the Carthaginians. Indeed, by advancing rapidly with his wings, Africanus had opened up a gap between his Italian and Iberian forces. Surely this was a vulnerability which could have been exploited by Hasdrubal. Indeed, one famous 20th century historian was scathing of Scipio's actions at Ilipa, claiming that had Africanus been facing an Alexander, the outcome of the battle may have been different. The obvious implication here is that the Macedonian would have led a cavalry charge through the gap, as he did at Gaugamela. Was Hasdrubal Gisco just so incompetent that he missed such an obvious opportunity to defeat the Romans? Or was he placed in a more difficult position than initially seems apparent? Several considerations need to be remembered. The first is the lack of situational awareness ancient commanders had to contend with. They did not have the convenience of drone or satellite footage to see the whole battlefield, and Hasdrubal probably only had a very limited visual range. Ancient battlefields were dusty, and with the movement of 45,000 men, there is a good possibility that Hasdrubal may not have understood what was happening, even if he had a direct view of the Roman manoeuvres. Indeed, he probably had to wait for reports from the local commanders in different parts of the line, rather than relying upon his own observations. These had to be made on foot or horseback, which took some time. The command decision cycle is a key limiting factor here. This refers to the amount of time it takes for reports to be transmitted up the chain of command to the decision maker, then back down again to generate action, the army's central nervous system, so to speak. This imposes a minimum time in which the Carthaginians could have reacted effectively had they decided to do so. This is the first consideration. Secondly, even when these reports arrived, it's unclear that any of the frontline commanders would have noticed the gap that had opened up between the Roman divisions. Most probably, the Roman movements would have been extremely confusing to the Carthaginians. This kind of maneuver was very rare in ancient warfare, and there was no reason to think they even knew what they were looking at. Many may have simply reported that the enemy was advancing. The third consideration is the fact that Hasdrubal had no central reserve to exploit this gap. His cavalry and elephants were deployed on the flanks, and if he attacked with his infantry centre, there were 20,000 Iberians ready to execute a counter-envelopment. The real answer here is that the Romans advanced with such speed that the Carthaginian command apparatus could simply not react effectively. In any case, the Punic army was in good order, well positioned on good defensive ground before its camp. Given the circumstances, staying put made a great deal more sense than attacking blind and disordering your own formation. The Carthaginian line braced for the assault. As the legionaries wheeled into a line of battle, the velites, wheeling towards the flanks, attacked the elephants. The poor creatures were peppered with hundreds of javelins. Reeling from the pain, many panicked and trampled their own infantry, causing great disorder. The Roman military now had 70 years of experience in engaging elephants, and their light infantry made short work of these units. As soon as the heavy infantry line had formed a line of battle, the hastati moved to engage the Spaniards. The fighting on the flanks was hot and heavily contested, but as the tribunes and centurions began to rotate the maniples, the Iberians could simply not cope with the tempo of the heavy infantry assault. Their frontline units, already weakened by hunger, quickly became exhausted by the rapidity of the sustained Roman attacks and began to give ground. As the maniples pushed forward, one small charge at a time, the Roman cavalry pushed back their Carthaginian opponents, giving the velites space to envelop the end of the line. As the end units of the Iberian infantry came under pressure, both from the heavy infantry maniples to their front and the rain of javelins from their flank, they began to withdraw towards the centre of the Punic formation. In the centre with the Africans, Hasdrubal knew the battle was not going well. His line was being crushed from both ends. However, there was precious little he could do about it. His elite Africans were not engaged, but he dare not weaken his centre. To their front, the tribesmen of the Edetani and Oretani were now drawing close. At a walk, the Iberians would have closed the gap with the legions in about 12 minutes. At a distance of around 50 metres from the Punic line, the Iberians paused. Applying a kind of close disengagement, small units ran forward to hurl missiles and abuse without coming to blows, retreating again to the safety of their line when the enemy reacted. When units of Africans moved out to engage them, the Iberians retreated. Without the order to advance in line, the Africans could simply not come to grips with the Spaniards, who stood just out of reach, banging their shields and screaming their war cry. The Africans were pinned. They could not move to the flanks to aid their allies with such a large force of infantry to their front, and they could not effectively engage the Iberians, who simply retreated when they advanced, maintaining the combat at missile distance. Finally, they could not charge, as advancing would invite total envelopment if the wings collapsed. On the flanks, it was only a matter of time. Although outnumbered, the Romans held all the advantages. These legionaries were near professionals. They were fit, well armed and armoured, well trained in the use of their weapons, and the Roman formation was optimised around this kind of engagement. Many of the tribesmen on the flanks, men of the Turdetani, had only recently been mobilised by the Carthaginians, and were generally farmers and artisans. With the Punic line enveloped, there was only so far the wings could retreat. The centre moved back to keep contact, but, eventually, the wings broke under the enormous pressure. Like a shattering pane of glass, panic rippled through the Punic army as order on the wings broke down and the men began to run towards the camp. With the wings in full retreat, the Africans had no choice but to rush for the safety of their palisade. The fact that Hasdrubal had placed the army so close to the camp saved a good portion from destruction. Nonetheless, thousands were cut down by the pursuing Romans, or trampled by other fugitives as they tried to get through the gates. The mighty Carthaginian army, some 70,000 strong, had degenerated into a panicking mob. The battle was lost, but with the Romans in close pursuit, survival was still at stake. As Africanus formed up the legions for his final assault on the camp, a massive thunderstorm blanketed the plain in blinding rain. The ancient world was highly religious, and many of the Romans saw this as a very bad omen. Indeed, the weather was so bad that many of the men struggled to return to the Roman camp. A good portion of the Punic army had survived, but there could be no mistake. The field of Ilipa belonged to Scipio. Aftermath. The night of the battle, the Romans rejoiced in their victory. Their losses had been light, and they had defeated an army twice their strength. The Carthaginians expected an attack on their rampart at first light, and spent the night improving their defences. However, it was not the Romans that compelled Hasdrubal to withdraw, but the defection of his allies. The chief of the Turdetani, Atenes, led his men out of the camp and sought a meeting with Scipio. He surrendered his forces and several oppida. This compelled Hasdrubal to move towards the river Baetis. However, the retreat quickly devolved into a rout. Harried by the Roman cavalry, the remains of the army began to disperse. Thousands were killed along the river, and Hasdrubal led the remnant, barely 6,000 men, to a rocky hilltop where they bivouacked. Seeing how desperate the situation had become, Hasdrubal abandoned the army and made his way to the coast, where a Punic merchant ship took him to Gades. There, along with Margo, they left the peninsula. The rest of Hasdrubal Gisco's mighty army was either captured by the Romans or dispersed amongst the neighbouring tribes. The massive Punic Empire in Spain was no more. In less than 40 years, it had risen from the ashes of the truceless war to dominate all of Iberia and elevate Carthage to her greatest power, only to be shattered by one man and one army. Rome now had her own Spanish Empire, but now she inherited the problems empire imposed. Immediately, Scipio faced the rebellion of some of his Iberian allies, led by his erstwhile friend, Hannibales. Leaving some of his forces at New Carthage, Africanus confronted the Iberians up the Ebro River Valley. In a bloody battle, Africanus trapped the Iberian army in a valley and cut it to pieces. This instability was simply normal in Hispania, and Rome would now spend the next 2 centuries trying to subdue one rebellious tribe after another. Indeed, Rome's new Spanish Empire would require the greatest military investment in the Republic's history, with the deployment of a consular army to the province for the majority of the 2nd century. The more things changed in Spain, the more they stayed the same. In 205, Africanus returned to Rome to stand for the consular elections. Although he was far too young to hold the office, there was no stopping the people from electing their own Hannibal to the supreme command. After his election, the consul was allocated Sicily as his province, with orders to cross to Africa and bring the war to the Punic homeland. Before he left Spain, Africanus rode with a delegation to Gades, the last Punic outpost on the peninsula. There, in a field outside the city, he secretly met a young Numidian nobleman, Massinissa. The Numidian thanked Scipio profusely for releasing his beloved nephew, an act of clemency that had earned his eternal gratitude. He had intended to say his thanks in person, and indeed to defect to Scipio, but Spain was a strange and dangerous country, and there had not been an opportune time. Massinissa explained the situation in Numidia, that he had been denied the throne once held by his father, and that he had no love for Carthage. The two men agreed that if Scipio landed in Africa, Massinissa would be by his side. So, now, the war entered its final phase. Africa would take its turn in enduring the blood and fire of war. A Roman Hannibal was on his way. With Massinissa by his side, Africanus would cut a swath of destruction through the Carthaginian heartland, a road that would eventually lead to the grassy field of Zama. There, Africanus and Hannibal would face each other in one titanic, final struggle, a battle that would finally end the most terrible conflict the Mediterranean world had ever seen.